What's up, everybody? I hope you're all having a blessed weekend. Today we're going to talk about the incoming financial reset, which is a hugely important topic because it's going to affect every single one of us. And so if you understand what's going on, it'll help you to prepare ahead of time so that when the reset occurs, you'll not only weather the reset, but you'll also prosper from it. Now, what we're not going to do is we're not going to talk about politics, and we're not going to get into conspiracy theories because there are a lot of other YouTube videos for that. So you can click away if that's what you're looking for. What we are going to do is I'm going to bring up some historical precedents that you probably haven't heard of and map that over to what the government has been executing recently to show you a roadmap of the probable outcomes out there. And then I'm going to talk about how I'm preparing for it myself. So having said that, let's get to it. I've broken down this video into 5 segments to help us get through the content. So the first segment talks about the financial reset itself, why it suddenly gained so much popularity. The second segment's talking about the historical precedents and how we've been here before. The third segment's going to talk about the rise of crypto, an alternative form of currency in the digital age, and how that impacts everything. The fourth segment's talking about what the government has been doing lately. And the fifth segment is talking about what I'm doing in myself personally to prepare for the incoming reset. So let's get to it. Talks of a financial reset is not new. Let me just make that clear. It's been going on for many decades. And basically, as the insurmountable debt just keeps growing and growing, the cacophony of people talking about financial reset just keeps growing and growing as well. Well, most recently what has happened was this individual, Anton Kombyakov, came, he's the special advisor to Vladimir Putin, and he came out and basically said, look, the US, Trump's going to dump all the debt of the United States into basically cryptocurrencies, and then once that happens, once that occurs, he's going to just dump everything, devalue it to pretty much oblivion so that they can kind of start from scratch again and, save the dollar and then, do the financial reset. And so while that is definitely not a new idea, the fact that who said it was this person, so that just, ignited the whole mainstream media. So then everybody started talking about it, and now it has been ratcheted up, and now we have all kinds of, YouTube. If you see YouTube these days, there's just like no shortage of, financial reset plan with crypto going on. So, yeah, so. Well, here's another one, I guess, right? But I guess you're watching this version because you probably have seen my other videos and you know what kind of logic I apply and information I gather to give you my analysis and my thoughts on things. So let's get to it. So the first thing I want to talk about is essentially the fact that you're not going to be paying off this debt, right? And this is why the interest in this whole financial reset keeps going up. And if you look at things, right, and it's the math, right? It has nothing to do with politics or anything. The U.S., generates about $5 trillion in tax revenues, right? The budget's about $6.7 trillion. So that means we're incurring new debt about $1.6 trillion every year. The national debt's at a staggering $37 trillion, and even with the, recent budget cuts with the, big, bold, beautiful bill of $163 billion, we're still, not in a good position. And I guess the best way to really put into light what this means is by removing 8 zeros. And by doing that, because nobody knows what the hell $1 trillion is, right? Like, it's such a huge amount of money, you can't even figure it out. But when you remove the 8 zeros, it becomes like your family income, right? So let's take a look at it from, let's say, an individual family income point of view. So let's say you're making $51,000 a year, okay? Like after taxes, right? Which is like the 5.1 trillion. So let's say your family, the income earner makes $51,000 after a year. Well, the family's spending $67,000 every year, right? So they're spending more than the money that they're making every year. And so every year they're in the red, right? They're going into debt about $16,520 every year because of this imbalance, right? Of spending more than what you make. And then let's say that your credit card bill, because of all of that you've been doing for so many years, is $370,000, right? That's essentially the 37 trillion. So let's say, you have a $370,000 credit bill. You're making 51,000, but you're spending 67,000, right? And then you go talk to, mom, pops, and the kids and say, look, we're going to tighten our belts. We're going to cut $1,630. We're going to spend $1,630 less this year because we got this huge. You see what I'm saying? Like, this is an untenable. I mean, this tightening is like not going to do anything, right? It's literally not going to do anything. And there are people who are saying, well, the tariff revenues are $350 billion a year. $350 billion a year tariff revenues, like, okay. Let's say you get a bonus check of $3,500 every year on top of your 50. That's really not going to change anything, right? That's really not going to change anything. So even with budget cuts and tariff revenues, you've got this huge debt on your credit card, right? You're spending more than you make, and you're in the red every year, and so you're going to have to keep swiping your credit card and increasing your debt. Right? And this only works because the United States happens to also be the credit card issuer, right? So what's going on is the United States just has this unlimited, it's like an American Express like black card. There's no credit limit. You can just keep spending because they just keep raising the debt ceiling until forever and ever and ever. And so there's no discipline. But you see where I'm going with this, right? This is an impossibility. If you come to any bank with this setup and ask for the bank for a loan or a mortgage, nobody's going to lend you money. Nobody's going to. Why would they lend you? Dude, you're terrible finances and you're not going to get out of this hole given like how much money you make and even with your spending cuts. Why would I lend you money? I wouldn't lend you. If I lend you money, I'm going to charge you like a stupid high interest rate because I think you're going to default. Right? But that's basically what's going on. And so there's this concept, right, of inflating away the United States debt or any debt. And the idea to inflate away the debt is basically what you do is you just print more money and you devalue the dollar essentially. So let's say you owned $1,000 in debt, right? Well, I'm going to print so much money that $1,000 isn't worth as much anymore because what you used to buy with $1,000, now you can only buy like a sandwich with because I printed so much money. So now when I pay back that debt that I originally borrowed, so when I originally borrowed that $1,000, it bought a car, right? But now that I printed so much money, that $1,000 is worthless pretty much. It can buy like a McDonald's sandwich now at most, right? And I'm going to pay you back it's still $1,000 I'm paying you back, but it's worthless. And so that is the idea here, is to inflate away the debt by just printing money and devaluing, right, the debt that you owe. So the debt is actually worth less, literally worthless, and then you pay it off, right? But there's problems with that, right? And the main problem with that is if you print too much money, what happens to the money? It becomes monopoly money. It's not worth as much, and you see that with what happens with the dollar. And what has been going on with the dollar? Well, let me just show you recently, like in the year 2025, this is the dollar index, and the dollar has just been completely tanking. I mean, this literally looks like, a programmed, it essentially is a programmed devaluation of the dollar. And what this means is inflation. And you're just basically getting poorer. Unless you're getting paid that much more money by your employer, you're getting poorer because whatever money that the employer is paying you in your paycheck is now not able to buy anywhere near as much as it used to buy. So it's a form of tax, and you probably have heard this before, but inflation and printing of money is a form of stealth taxation. And you get poorer as a result. It's just like giving the government tax money. But it helps the government because it devalues the debt that the government owes as well. You see how this all works, right? Why it's good for the government to do this? So I mean, the problem is if they have runaway inflation, then you have a systemic potential risk and a shock, and that's what we're all afraid about, right? But like as I was saying, you know, when you run into the situation where your finances in the house are so terrible, like nobody wants to lend you money because you're so much in debt and you're not doing anything, you're not earning more money, and you're not spending much less money, you'll never be able to pay off that debt. I'm not going to loan you that loan or give you that mortgage, or if I do, I'm going to charge you a really high interest rate, right? Well, that's basically what's going on to all the countries, not just the United States. All the developed nations are in this hole where they're so in debt, they have no way of paying it off. And so people who are giving them loans basically to take more debt are asking for higher and higher interest rates, right? And that's basically what's been going on since 2020. And I've talked and shown you this chart multiple times now. But I hope it's very clear now why long-term interest rates, which the government does not control, have been shooting up, particularly after 2020 when they did the crazy money printing due to COVID, right? And they pressed the nuclear financial button, essentially. So that's basically what's been going on in this first segment. I just wanted to talk about is the situation that we're in. It's not a good situation. There's no way out of it. We're not going to be able to pay off this debt. So the question now becomes, like, how are we going to deal with it, right? There's got to be a way to figure it out, because at this rate, it's just going to collapse under the weight of the debt, or we're going to have hyperinflation, runaway inflation, by printing so much money in order to devalue the debt in order to deal with it. So in the second segment, we're going to talk about we've been here before. And you might have heard this, you know, people talk about, like, well, you know, in the 1970s and the 1930s, and I will talk about those too because those are relevant, but I'm going to be talking about something you probably haven't heard about, which is, you know, much earlier what happened, right? But it's hugely important because it really shows us the probability of what's going to happen and where we're going to go with this. Now let's talk about the stuff everybody talks about, which is, you know, the 1970s. And what happened in the 70s was, you know, Nixon came out and there was something called the Nixon shock. But basically the main thing he did was he severed the link between the dollar and gold, right? So throughout the history of America until 1970, basically, 1971, you could go with your bills, your dollars, to a bank and get gold and demand to get gold back, right, by law. For hundreds of years, that was the case. And in 1971, Nixon basically said, nope, no more, you know, there's no tie between gold like that with the dollar. And that effectively allowed, you know, the central banks to just print as much money as they wanted to, right? Because you didn't have to have the supply of gold that backed up the amount of money you printed. And so that became known as fiat money, fiat meaning paper money, and it's basically monopoly money, right? You just print as much as you want. At the end of the day, there's no, you know, rules of how much you can or can't print. It's just print as much as you can, basically, right? That's basically what happened. So that was a, you know, but the point here is that was a very big deal, right? So in terms of like changing the law. And so that's a sign, right? Anything can happen, right? The government can wake up one morning and do boom, and then like something that's been like the way for hundreds of years suddenly gone in an instant. And so that's the point of, you know, in the financial system, that's the point of what this, you know, Nixon shock is, bringing it up in the 1970s. The other thing that happened was in the 1930s, right? And so back then, long time ago, what they did was they revalued gold, and they're tricky about it. So what they did was they actually made it illegal, right, to own gold bullion. You can own gold jewelry, but anything that was financial currency type of, you know, gold, like gold bullion or specie, it was illegal to own it, right? The government gave you a time window to give it back. And if you were caught holding gold bullion or specie, you'd go to jail, right, and get fined. Like literally go to jail. They'll take you to jail for it. And so they confiscated all the gold in the country. And then you know what they did after they confiscated? So they took all the gold from everybody. And then what they did was they revalued the gold, right? And they basically said, hey, now gold is worth, I believe they revalued it, it was worth $20. And then they revalued the gold to $35 overnight. But of course they did that after they took all your gold. So that's a second example of how the government can actually just implement drastic measures, right? They'll sign an executive order and boom, there it is, right? Overnight, and there's nothing you can do. And so here's another yet situation where the government has been doing this and has done it in the past. And these are the two typically brought up things from the past that people point out to you. And you might have read or seen this elsewhere. But, what I want to bring up to you, and what you probably haven't heard unless you're a student of economics, were the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. This is hugely important, and this actually will give us a guide on what's probably going to happen. Because it was then when the government actually set up, right, the existing system that we have today. And it was, in essence, the financial reset from yesteryear. And that's why I think it's hugely important to look at what we did before. But if we're going to do that, we got to go back and down the time and see what the heck was going on back then. So the first thing I want to bring up to you was the dollar wasn't the first currency of America, right? There was something called the Continental, okay? This was money that was used during the American Revolution against the British. And it was called the Continental. And this was the paper money they used, right, to fund everything. The Americans used this as literally their money. And guess what happened to it? Take a wild guess. What happened was they printed too much of this paper money and it just basically became worthless. So they had to get rid of it. And so that was the birth of the very first paper money currency of the United States and death of it. No different than all the other currencies that have ever existed since the beginning of time. It died because they printed way too much of it to fund things. Now, after the American Revolution and the death of the Continental, what happened was, they attempted to create a national bank, right? So like one bank for the entire country. And they created the first national bank. So this is what the first national bank looked like. It was the Bank of North America. And what it was this bank that overlaid over the state banks and commercial banks. And it would get involved in, all the bank activities of lending, setting things, and all that. But it failed. And then they created another one. This is actually the second national bank, right? So a second national bank was created after failure. And then this one was nixed, right? It was nixed by the president. Because, and this is why I think it's relevant to today, it was thought of that it wasn't part of, having a central bank like that wasn't what the forefathers kind of thought, right? It gave too much control into a central authority. It wasn't in the spirit of America. And so they got rid of it as a result. And you hear that today, right? You hear with especially the current administration, the beef they have going on between, the Federal Reserve and the White House and interest rates and, threats of firing the Fed chairman, Powell, and perhaps even restructuring, getting rid of the Fed itself. These are things that have been talked about recently, right? Because, we're kind of repeating what was going on back then. And so just keep that in mind. This is not new. In fact, they did end up abolishing the national bank altogether. And that resulted in something called the Panic of 1837. So they got rid of the national bank. So what happened was all the local banks, right, and state banks, they were just printing their own notes, essentially money that was basically a promise, to whatever you submitted to the bank. And that circulated around the country. And there are all kinds of difference of notes, right? Depending on which bank and which state you went to, there's a different note, which is kind of like what's going on today with all the different cryptocurrencies. But we're going to get to that later. So there's all these banks printing different notes, and people are paying and using these notes. And what happened was, well, as always, there was a speculative bubble. What was going on was the United States government was selling a lot of land to fund a lot of infrastructure projects. And then there was like this trigger from England when they raised interest rates back then that kind of popped the bubble. And then everything collapsed, and actually the entire country went into a depression, right? That was a depression. It lasted for about a decade. Everybody lost their money, the banks collapsed, all the notes and everything happened, and it was literally a panic, right? Hence the name Panic of 1837. So it went through that, which is something we're probably going to go through, if not already, right? And that then forced... Oh, I wanted to show this graphic here because, that's kind of like, it was a really, really tough time, right? We know about the Great Depression, but not many people know about what happened in the Depression after the Great Panic of 1837. It was terrible, right? And it also lasted for like a decade. It was really, really tough times. But it was so long ago that people don't really talk about it as much. And then, we had the Civil War, right? And this caused a lot of demand, right, to spend for the government to fund the war. And, we're in this situation now with the geopolitical situation in the world, with Ukraine and the United States funding a lot of the activities over there. And then there's all kinds of other geopolitical potential, explosions that can happen with Iran and Middle East and, with Asia and China and all this stuff. So like, if we ever get into a situation where these things continue to erupt and there needs to be more funding for these wars, well, it's kind of reminiscent of what was going on back then. Back then it was a civil war. And to be frank, the way things are going in the United States, we have to be very careful that nobody wants this to happen. So we should all work against something that would ever lead to a civil war. But you can see the rhetoric between left and right in the United States is just ratcheting up, right? With every year, there's some new incident that just makes it boil even higher and higher. And hopefully we don't get anywhere near to another civil war. But, it is concerning the way things at least are ratcheting up. And what happened was they got so broke, okay? They didn't have any way to pay for the war that the United States had to step in and issue what is known as the greenback. And essentially it was paper money that was not backed by gold or silver, okay? That was a big distinction. But it was backed by bonds, right? Treasuries. And you could use this to buy and sell stuff. So in effect, the greenback was actually the very first fiat paper money that the United States came up with. It wasn't backed by gold or silver, but you could use to transact on it. And that was what its purpose was. And now what the government did was they forced all the banks, remember there's no more national banks now, so what they forced the banks to do was they had to buy these greenbacks, right? It became a law that they had to have these greenbacks, and that they would then also tax other forms of money, other notes. It started with like 3 or 5%, in order for the banks to not use them as much and push the greenbacks more, and also for the people to use greenbacks more. You could pay your taxes with greenbacks and so on and so forth, in order to crowd out all those other notes that the individual banks were using at the time. Eventually, they raised the tax to the other notes to 10%, which effectively killed all the other notes. And then the greenback became the main note used in the country, and in essence, the first national currency. So this whole episode that I just described is hugely important because it tells you of how back then the government was out of cash. They had to fund all these things, including wars. And they had no choice but to issue their own debt directly. And they used it in conjunction with all the different little notes and different little currencies, if you want to call it that the local banks were using. And then they eventually crowded out all those other currencies and made it the national currency. And so that is really important to keep in mind, because there's a lot of similarities between what's going on now and what happened when they first got everything together and created the national currency. Now in the third part of this video, which is about the rise of crypto, we're going to talk about how this new form of digital currency is reminiscent of all the banknotes that all the individual banks were creating back then during the 1800s. And the first thing we want to talk about is what spawned crypto itself, and that was the great financial crisis, which was Lehman Brothers, right? Remember this back in 07, 08? This, I mean, that pretty much sums up how we all felt back then. It was just an unexpected, like, freaking blowout of the entire financial system. So much so that, you know, the banks were too big to fail. They had too much debt. There was systemic risk, so they were just bailed out left and right around, all over the world. And that caused all the headlines to shout this. And that's where crypto came about, right? And you see, and I mentioned this before, but this news headline is in, okay, the Genesis block of Bitcoin, right? You see that same headline written into the Genesis block of Bitcoin. So as we will never forget why Bitcoin and the blockchain technology that runs it was created. It was because of all the bank bailouts and basically money becoming monopoly money and being printed out of thin air, and the banks just, you know, getting a little slap in the wrist and continuing to exist. And there was a lot of backlash on that, and the result, one of the results of that backlash, besides Occupy Wall Street, was the creation of Bitcoin, which is really interesting if you think about it, right? It's a lack of faith in central banking authorities and the government, essentially, right? So they created a peer-to-peer money that didn't need a central authority in between to process things. That's essentially what cryptocurrency is and what Bitcoin is. And this thing really changed the landscape. It is a completely new way of transacting with money that never existed before and could only exist because of digital technology. So you couldn't create this system before you created basically the internet and computers. And, well, once we did, we created it, right? Or maybe it was teleported back in time by AI. That's who the creator of Bitcoin is. But nevertheless, that's the reason why Bitcoin was created, okay? And, you know, if you look at it, I put this up because, you know, you'll see a lot of this stuff, right? Where people will talk about Bitcoin. Let me just read this to you. It is about tokenized stores of value backing competing units of account from competing issuers transmitting over a decentralized method of payment through a means of exchange, either as gas or a money processor to convert to settle the transaction. Right? And saying as explain it as if you're, you know, I'm like, no, that's super. This is the opposite of keeping it assessment. What? That's a gobbledygook of word salad. Like, what does that actually mean? We're not going to do that. That is exactly what we're going to avoid, and something that I will never do. Look, people like to use big words and say a lot of things to seem like they're knowledgeable and smart, but in essence, they're just confusing people, right? Or have insecurities. Listen, we're just going to keep it simple and keep it Sesame Street, as I always try to do here. And so when we talk about the cryptocurrencies today, right, after, well, I was going to say Bitcoin, that looks like but basically after Bitcoin came out, we have this whole slew of cryptocurrencies, right? And so what the heck, right? And then we even have, you know, meme coins and all this stuff. So if you're not in it, when you look at it from outside, it's like, what the heck? This is very confusing. But, you know, if I were to just boil it down really simply, right? Look, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is a way to basically transact with digital money without having a third party. That's the main thing, right? And if you look at the cryptocurrency world, there's really four categories, okay? The first is like cryptocurrency money, like you actually use it as currency, right? To settle things and to pay things, right? The second one is more of a utility, right? They use it for other reasons. This is where you might have heard of Ethereum or something like that. These are utility tokens. They're used for other reasons, such as to prove that you did something, or to use it as a form of even government, which is something, if you might have heard what a DAO is. But in any event, that's the second category, right? They use these tokens as utilities. Then the third category is something called stable coins. And now these are cryptocurrencies that are actually tied to something, right? Hence the word tied to something that's stable, right? And so typically what these stable coins are tied to is the United States dollar, or maybe even some United States Treasury debt, right? And that is what the stable coin category is. And then the fourth and last category is what you call central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. And this is basically the central bank version of crypto, right? They use the technology that crypto uses, but from a central banking point of view. So they'll create a central money supply that runs through the central bank and everything, but it's using the technology under crypto, right? And they can control and shut down when and what you use the money for and who can use it, and so on. And you see the Chinese using it based on your social, basically, report card, and so on and so forth. So that's the fourth category, CBDCs. So if you just think about it in those four ways, that's the simplest way I can explain to you all this cryptocurrency stuff. One is like the payment system, like actual currency. The second is utilities, which is a big umbrella of all the other stuff that's out there they use it for. Like, even NFTs, like you might have heard of that, like bubble that popped before with the Bored Ape thing. That's the second category. The third category is stable coins, as I said, backed by dollar or treasury or even gold. And then the fourth one is central bank digital currencies. So just keep in mind those are four categories of crypto, okay? That's all you need to know for now. And so this whole emergence of this ecosystem of different cryptocurrencies has come out. And if you recall what I talked about earlier about the banks, the individual banks before the Fed and the greenback was created, all these commercial banks in different states and even the state banks, they were printing their own notes or money, basically, right? That worked within the state, and if you try to convert it to another state, you have to pay some, a fee or something. But basically, just like how there's so much cryptocurrencies today, there was a lot of notes back then before the formation of the singular one. And so that's the important analogy to carry over here. Think of today's cryptocurrencies and the issuers, the companies that create and manage these cryptocurrencies, as those as those small commercial banks from the yesteryear during the formation of the system we're in now. Except they're not banks, they're issuers, but it's the same concept. They're creating their own kind of money that people are kind of using, and it's this whole like gobbledygook spaghetti system, right, that is the current state right now. You'll see where I'm getting at, but we'll get to it later on in the next segments. So here in segment 4, we're going to talk about what has been going on, what has the government been doing lately that can give us an idea of the direction where we're heading in. And the first thing I want to talk about was the establishment of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. Now, you probably heard of this. Trump came out and said, we're going to have a Bitcoin reserve because we're going to make Bitcoin a big part, just like gold is. And, all the Bitcoin maxis, and I'm a Bitcoin maxi, were like, oh, Bitcoin to $1 million and all that. Well, to make a long story short, what happened was they did create the reserve, but didn't go out and buy a lot of Bitcoin. So everybody was thinking like, oh my God, government's going to come out and buy like billions and billions of dollars of Bitcoin. Well, that did not happen. What happened was they just took their existing Bitcoin stash, which was from confiscations of illegal, stuff going on. Government confiscated Bitcoin from different entities, pulled that up, and then just converted that into its reserve. Pretty much, right? For by and large, that's what happened. So that kind of like, was like, buzzkill. They're not going out buying like a ton of Bitcoin and so on and so forth. But what's important to note here was they did create the reserve, right? There is now a Bitcoin reserve of the United States government. And so that's important to consider, and that ties into, the way I'm preparing for the future, is this creation is not something to just tutu and not acknowledge. It's a pretty important deal. The other thing that was created was the Genius Act. Now this is important. You need to know what the Genius Act is because for cryptocurrency, and remember I said there was different kinds of cryptocurrency, so the third category I talked about, which was the stable coins, which is the ones backed by dollars or US treasuries and so on and so forth. Well, the Genius Act basically, what it did was for stable coin issuers, right, they made it so that only approved institutions could issue it, right? And then they say that it must be backed one by one, right? And they would regulate this and, okay, not do, you know, basically money laundering and illegal stuff. But basically, the Genius Act is important because of this fact. It was a way to kind of, you can see the government trying to control and regulate the stable coin part of the cryptocurrency because it's backed by the US dollar. And this will be important because what a lot of people are saying is that the United States is just going to dump its debt into stable coins, right? Which it's trying to regulate. And then once the debt is all parked into stable coins, it's going to devalue the stable coins so that the debt's worthless and the dollar is still okay. What died was the stable coins, right? So that's kind of like, I guess, what a lot of videos and people are saying. And let me tell you why. You know, that's probably not going to happen in a couple of slides from here. But, you know, the other thing the United States did was, you know, it did the supplementary leverage reserve. So the SLR, they're thinking about, this is Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary of the U.S., he's saying we're going to change this and loosen it up. So essentially, they're going to make it easier for banks to buy treasuries, basically, right? Remember I said, like, the United States, it's like lending that family a loan. Right? No one wants to lend you because your finance is so bad. Well, what Bessent is doing, at least for the banks, he's making it easier to lend, right? So there's two ways they're doing that. One way is there's this ratio, and they're trying to get cash and treasuries away from the denominator, meaning you can buy more treasuries without affecting, you know, the rule, which I believe is 5%. You got to keep, if you're going to do anything, you have to have 5% of it, right, in-house in the bank. The other way is maybe reduce the 5% to actually 3%. Either which way, they're trying to make it easier for the banks to buy treasuries so that there's actually demand for the debt of the United States, even though the House of Order of Finances is terrible. So that's also what's going. So that tells you they're getting pretty desperate, right? They're trying to do all kinds of things to fund the debt and increase the debt because they're running out of options, right? They got to change the rules. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the stable coins, right? You gotta understand, it's not such a, you know, the landscape of stable coins is by far USDT, okay? The orange is the hugest one, and the other one is USDC. The rest are tiny, like footnotes, okay? So USDT and USDC are the main stable coins, right? But if you look at the aggregate number, right, it's about 220 billion right now, all the stable coins. And stable coins, look, if you remember Luna, Jae-Kwon, my fellow Korean bro who's in jail, collapsed, right? And this is a stable coin. Luna was supposed to be backed by the dollar, right? And it died somehow. So that tells you, even though it's backed by something, can happen, right? Stuff happens and it'll die. And this is why the United States is trying to regulate it. But even with the regulation, this thing can happen because it's algorithmic driven and there's people involved, right? So just because it's regulated doesn't mean it's going to be okay. But let me get back to the question about the size of you know, 220 billion, all stable coins. This is why you cannot park $37 trillion of debt into $220 billion of stable coins. It's just not going to work, right? It's way, way different in orders of magnitudes of size. So for just that reason, in no short time will they ever be able to park $37 trillion of debt into 250 without exploding the market. And that's going to take a long time, even if they do explode. And if they do, it's going to devalue everything. So it's just not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen that way. What they want to do, though, is they want more stable coins to use backed by treasuries. So as stablecoin usage grows, so does demand for US treasuries, meaning demand for US debt through the interest of stablecoins, a new type of money. And that's what they're trying to do, right? So that's what's really going on. If you see headlines that they're going to dump 37 trillion into 250 billion and devalue that, it's just not going to happen mechanically because the numbers don't add up. It's just so much bigger than 250. I mean, it's just, you don't need to be a mathematician to understand that, right? So that's not going to happen, right? But what they're going to do is increase demand for US Treasury and debt through the growth over time, organically, of stablecoins. Yet stablecoins have this issue, as we've seen, it's not just Terra, of blowing up every so often. Now, remember how the government confiscated gold? Well, they could confiscate stablecoins really easily, right? There's actually a back door in the wallet where they can actually digitally just cut you off from your wallet for stablecoins. So should they ever want to, right, after, let's say, stablecoins grow to some size over many years, and then they want to like confiscate, they can do it in an instant, right? Unlike before, they had to rely on your trust, and I'm sure some people never turned their gold bullion in. But with stablecoin, they could flip the switch and that's it, right? That's it. And then they could devalue it and do it. So it is possible what they're thinking, right? Because it's digital. Just want to bring that up. The other thing that's going on is that the Fed itself, right, released a paper on how it could revalue gold. Okay, so that is something that could happen as well. Because if the Fed is writing a paper itself on how it could revalue gold, it is something that they're considering. Make no mistake about it. And they really, they basically said, look, there's 260 million ounces, currently valued at 42. So if we revalue it in today's price, which is now not 33, it's actually like 3,700 as I speak, it would, they would have a windfall. And if you calculate that number, it's somewhere around almost $1 trillion if they revalue gold to market price. But then again, it's just $1 trillion out of 37 trillion. That just shows you how much the debt is, right? So they'd have to revalue gold to like some crazy numbers. Like some people are saying they're going to revalue gold to $50,000 and that'll take care of the debt. Well, they can't really do it, right? If they revalue gold to some absurdly high number, the rest of the world market just won't buy it, right? You can't make that much of a gap between current market price and what you want to revalue it to. Right? Now they did from 20 to 35 back then, but that was within realm, right? So the point here is gold revaluation is definitely one of the levers they can pull, and they can pull on it, but they can't pull on it super hard, right? And if they don't pull it super hard, it's not going to really make that huge a dent, even though it will, every little bit will count. And that explains why, remember this? I made a whole episode in Fort Knox. Well, they were going to go and investigate this whole Fort Knox thing. They didn't because, and it was simple, right? There's no upside to it. If the gold's there, the gold's there, I guess. Yay. Gold's not there. That's not good news, right? That means the U.S. has less gold than it advertised. That's going to cause shockwaves and be a big problem for the country, meaning like it just lost a lot of money. So that's why they never went, right? Forget about all the talking they did about whether there's gold there or not. There's no good that's going to come out of that for them to go, right? Especially if they're thinking about revaluing gold, right? They want to just make it seem they have even as much gold or even more gold that they have, right? They would not want to make it seem like they have less gold than what's been advertised. So no, they're never going to go into Fort Knox and revalue it. The other thing I want to talk about is CBDCs really quickly, right? Like what they're going on now. Trump actually wrote an executive order to say no CBDCs. Not going to do CBDCs. So that's taken off the table for now. And that makes sense because, I mean, it's a competitor to stablecoins, ultimately, right? And, I know Trump and his family are into crypto, and they're doing quite well when it comes to issuing their own cryptocurrencies, right? So I can see why from a financial, I'm not saying that he is, but I can see a reason why, even if whether or not he is, doesn't matter. He doesn't want CBDCs right now, right? And so that's why you have the CBDCs being nixed, because it's issued and controlled by central bank and nobody else, not Trump or his family members. And so that's the current situation, is there's a no-go for CBDCs, even as other countries such as China and so on and so forth are embracing CBDCs and rolling it out already, right? So that's something to note. So what I do think is going to happen is that the government is going to try and use multiple ways to reduce the debt, which could include gold revaluation to a degree, right? Where they don't completely break the market, where they embrace stablecoins and promote it so that more stablecoin equals more demand for its debt and its ability to service it ultimately, right? And do the usual to fund budget cuts and all the other stuff. But those two things are definitely something that they're doing, in fact, right? But here's the thing. As we saw back in the 1800s, what they did was, with the national banks issuing all their different notes, like today's, all these issuers with different cryptocurrencies, the government allowed it. But eventually the government then printed its own note, right? The greenback. That hasn't happened yet because CBDC, dead now. But what happened back then was there was the financial panic, right? The Great Panic of 1837. That hasn't happened yet. Now, these things take many years. It's not happening overnight. So what I do think will happen is cryptocurrency is going to grow, not going to go anywhere, right? It's been already decades. Cryptocurrencies are here to stay, okay? Just at least accept that. It's been decades, right? It hasn't died. It's still here. It's going to be here. But what you have to understand is that there may be a bubble, right? Just like back then with all the notes, you know, after they got rid of the Second National Bank of the US, it got fluffy. There was bubbles formed, right? And it just blew up with all the different banknotes, just like it can blow up with all the different crypto stablecoins. And then because of a huge event, that's where the government needs to come in, and then the CBDC. So if you hear what I'm saying, it's actually, you can't do the CBDC now. It would seem very authoritative and strong-handed, right? To suddenly come out and enforce it. No, the better way is to endorse all these other currencies, these stablecoins, to come up and wait for some big bubble to blow up and for it to pop, right? And everybody then will be in a panic. And then you come in with the CBDC. Do you see what I'm saying? At that point in time, you will want a CBDC in the middle of a panic because you bring stability to government, right? And if you introduce it that way, people will embrace it, right? And then you tax the other notes like they did back in 1800s to get rid of them eventually. And so they will with the other cryptocurrency stablecoins will get taxed away. They'll eventually all die like all the banks issuing their own notes back in the 1800s. These issuers in different stablecoins will eventually die out because they're going to get taxed, and the government CBDC will be the one left standing. And the key here is the way it's introduced, right, is not in a strong authoritative top-down, force you have to use it way like the Chinese are doing, but rather as the savior, right? That's how it comes in, right? As the savior to the panic that was caused by the bubble that popped because of, you know, unbridled and reckless greed on the stablecoins and cryptocurrencies. Even though they're trying to regulate it, right? Bubbles still happen. Pop, come in as a hero. Everybody embraces it. Now you've got CBDCs. Policy can change, right? This goes beyond just the current administration. You can have multiple administrations, right? Like it did in the past. But that's the pathway I think we're heading towards, and probably going to happen in my lifetime. So that's why I'm taking action to prepare for it. So we finally hit the last segment of this video is, well, how am I preparing for this? Well, the first and obvious one is with gold, right? Because gold has been around forever and ever and ever, and it's not going to go away. It's been around for 1,000 years, and it's the safest safe haven asset you can have. I've been accumulating gold for the past many, many years, ever since 07, 08. And I've done very well with gold because it's just done nothing but just skyrocket, right? Especially recently. So if you look at gold, right, you can see, if I look at about 2022, this is gold spot price. We're now at 3,700, so even higher. Whereas ETF holdings, or the money going into the gold ETF, has not kept up, which means even as gold has increased in price, the amount of people buying the ETF GLD gold has not. So it means there's a demand imbalance, meaning there's not enough demand from the ETF side, paper money, chasing gold. So that means the people buying gold are spot gold, commodity traders, not the typical mom pop type of. So it's not yet hit mainstream, which means it has a lot of room, right, to go up, one would think. And that's what I think. Now, is it going to go up in a straight line? No. We're going to have ups and downs just like we had here, corrections and go up and consolidate. And that's what's going to happen. And most recently, what I told you is I actually got out of my physical gold and I'm into paper mining stocks, gold miners, GDX. And that enables me during consolidation periods or periods of corrections to go in and out really quickly, which is expensive to do with physical bullion, right? And as I said, ETF surging, right? So we're beginning to, so the most recent run up in gold, you see why. It's because the ETFs, right, is going up. There's money coming in now, meaning we're probably like inning number 3 where, the more mainstreamish funds and people are starting to accumulate more gold, right? Not just the early ones like me. And that's great because that's a second leg, right? That's going to give it the rocket boosters. Now, I said I've been going into GDX, right? So I wrote this whole write-up here the past month and a half after I sold off my physical gold and got into GDX. And I think the miners have that's usually like the next stage is when the miners in silver overtake gold, right? And that's been what's going on. And that's been returning me. And so I'm doing this because it gives me maneuverability to go in and out of it really quickly, because I do think we may have a correction. Usually if there's a stock market crash, the gold actually has margin calls occur to it, and even the best performing assets get sold off to raise cash to pay off the margin so you don't go bankrupt. And that's what happened in 07, 08, and I think that could happen, right? It doesn't mean it will happen, but in the event that it does, I'm still exposed to the, actually a lot better performance than gold itself through the miners. And then if there is a downturn, I can quickly get out of it, right, without any liquidity issues and fees, because it's just electronically traded and not a physical bullion transaction. Now I'll get back into bullion when I start seeing the dangers creep up again of the financial reset, and I've already shown you what we're looking out for in that. The other thing I'm doing is also I'm not in the stock market, because the stock market is, as I've said, way too concentrated. Look, the top 10 US stocks are at 40% of the entire market, right? This is super highly concentrated. This is not good. The last times we had this concentration didn't turn out well. In fact, we're so concentrated now. The only other time it was more concentrated than this was during the Great Depression. Jeez, that keeps coming back up, right? The other reason is the amount of US margin debt is at an all-time high. This is margin debt. So this is people borrowing money to then lever up and buy stocks is at an all-time high. So people are buying stocks with borrowed money. This is very dangerous, right? When this thing unwinds, it's going to be really, really bad, right? Because of the amount of margin calls that's going to cascade down into the system when we start going in the other direction. And the other thing is all the big players, the large hedge funds and all that, they've kept short. So basically what I'm telling you is I have a hedging portion of my net worth, okay, that is basically short stocks. It's by far the smallest amount of my, but it is short by being long volatility and short NASDAQ. And I keep it there in case the blow up happens, because it looks like there is going to be one, even if nobody can time it. And I just have it stashed over there for the time being while I write up GDX, right? And I'm able to maneuver in and out of it. So that's my current situation. Now, as things progress in this multi-year, right, pathway towards the financial reset, I know the things to look out for, which I showed you earlier. And as we get closer to the financial reset, I'll probably go back into physical gold, because that is the safest way in case there's an implosion of the system itself, and keep it with me, right? Because then it would be in my possession and not in any other possession. I also do have a stash of BTC that I've dollar cost averaged in around 30,000. So, now it's over 100,000. So I'm sitting pretty well with that one as well. That one's also, HODL. I'm not touching it. Just keep it there in a cold storage wallet. And that's the other, thing or asset class I have with me at the moment. So as time goes on, we'll see, and I'll make changes But the signposts that I'm looking at I've shared with you in this video, and I hope you learned a couple of things from this video that you can apply to your own analysis and the way you manage your risk on the pathway to a potential reset. Because like I said, they're not going to be paying the debt off. They're just not. So the other option is, to soft default, which is to hyperinflate it away, or to try and manage it and then maybe try and do some like reset in the way that I described to you earlier. So having said that, if this content was helpful, if you made it this far, give it a like and subscribe to the channel so that you can see more of this in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Peace out.